are exhorting everyone to buy local and buy early this holiday season to support your favorite local businesses. So please consider doing that this year in particular. And if you can come into the store, consider doing it on a weekday or in the morning. That really, really helps everybody. And I forgot to change my name, so let me do that real quick. And also remind you that we are going to be recording this event and posting it later onto YouTube. If you have any questions and do not want to appear on YouTube, you can just type them into the chat box on the side. You'll see the little yellow box around me. That's the person that's getting recorded.
Yes, as long as you stay muted, you will not be recorded and in that recording at all. So don't worry about that, and just use the chat box for questions. Dafydd and I throughout the evening will be also using the chat box to put in links to the books that everyone is talking about as we go. So you can find those there. We'll also be putting up a blog post in the morning at northshire.com. Give us a little time, who knows how the day will unfold, so maybe wait till say noon, but there will be a blog post on the Notes from the Shire blog at northshire.com that will have all of these titles in case you miss one as we go. And you can always email us at events@northshire.com. That's an email address that Dafydd and I share, and we're happy to get back to you if you heard something, didn't get a chance to make a note of it, and want to confirm what exactly it was. So I think that is all of the boring logistical stuff. We tonight are joined by two wonderful Northshire booksellers, one from our Saratoga store and one from our Vermont store. And then Dafydd and I also both have small lists to share with you. So we are going to have Mike Hare from the Saratoga store kick things off. He is a phenomenal bookseller. I don't know how he reads as much as he reads, and I read a lot, but Mike has us all beat. So he has some great new books to tell you about, and I'm going to turn it over to him to get things started off.
Okay, Rachel, thank you. And thanks everyone for tuning in. This is always a lot of fun and a pleasure to participate on the book chat, and glad to be back this evening. I have 6 books, and the first is called Squeeze Me by Carl Hiaasen. And many of you are probably familiar with Carl Hiaasen because he's written many books. This is his 15th, I believe, his 15th work of fiction. He's also written kids' books. He's written nonfiction as well, but he's basically a mystery writer. And this is a mystery called Squeeze Me. And I believe that most, if not all, of Carl Hiaasen's books are set in South Florida. He's from the Miami Beach, West Palm Beach area. And Squeeze Me is set in West Palm Beach, Florida. It's a contemporary setting, 2019, 2020. It's very contemporary at least as of last week, because what the book concerns and what it's about is a very high society lifestyle in this Florida community. And if you watch the election results last week, there was comment about how things are in Miami-Dade County and West Palm Beach is nearby. And it's sort of a lot of the commentators were saying it's sort of an entity unto itself in many ways, even though Florida is such a big state anyway, and there's so many divergent lifestyles down there. But the West Palm Beach society that Hiaasen kind of skewers and Squeeze Me is a very, very upper class, upper crust segment of society. And he begins the story with these women who are ungodly wealthy and also ungodly old. And they have very strong political beliefs. And their political hero was a person who has a home in South Florida. And he's patterned after a real president who has a home in South Florida, who may be going there permanently in a few months. We'll find out for sure within a few days if we haven't already. But these rich women are very strong in their devotion to the President of the United States, and they kind of know him. And they go to this charity gala in the heat of Florida, I don't know what time of the year it was, but it's very, very hot. And one of these very rich women goes missing at this charity function. She's about 5 foot tall. She weighs about 80 pounds. About 40 of those pounds are jewels. You sort of get the impression of this woman just being bedecked in all this jewelry and quite old. And she's gone and nobody knows what happens to her. And the book revolves around this disappearance in a very, very satiric way. And there are a lot of snakes involved in this book, and the snakes include pythons, and pythons, of course, can eat big things. So that might have something to do with this woman's disappearance in the book. And you've got some criminals that are involved in the book too, as they come into the plot. The criminals are a little bit dim. They aren't terribly quick on the draw. There is a wildlife investigator, a woman who spends a lot of time hunting alligators and things like that. So she gets involved because snakes are involved with this. There's a lot of money involved. The president, when he realizes that this rich woman, his supporter, is kidnapped, blames it on Mexican terrorists or something along those ilks. So you can kind of see parallels to what's happening in the real world today. But with the one, I've never read Carl Hiaasen before. This is the first time. It was a real treat for me to read this, because he is very funny. He's very satiric. The book is very raunchy. It's very off color. It's not at all politically correct. All kinds of strange things happen. The first lady in the book is not terribly satisfied with her husband, so she's not afraid to try to get that satisfaction elsewhere with some people in the Secret Service and that type of a thing. So you have all of these subplots going on, and it's all told in this very freewheeling manner. Hiaasen really kind of lets it all fly. I don't know if he does in his other books, but he certainly does here. And it's a wonderful skewering of what's happened in segments of society today. There's a little touch of Mark Twain and even Swift and how he writes, I think. So it's a book that I would definitely recommend. And again, Carl Hiaasen, Squeeze Me is the first of my recommendations this evening. My second book is a nonfiction book, and this is Hiaasen's book is sort of a romp, and this book is much more serious, and it's called Say Nothing. And I imagine many of you watching have already read this book because it did come out a year ago. It's now out in paperback, so I'm talking about it now as a new paperback book. And Say Nothing is about the Troubles, about Northern Ireland in the 1960s and 1970s. And just like Squeeze Me, the first couple pages of the book, there's a disappearance of this rich woman, and then it all becomes a satirical, funny kind of a trek. This book also begins with a disappearance, but this is a real life disappearance of a mother of multiple children in Belfast in the 1970s. And this woman goes missing and nobody can figure out what happened. But unlike Squeeze Me, this is not fiction. This is a real story, and it's a very serious story about what happened in Northern Ireland, not just to this woman, but what was going on during the Troubles, during the struggles of Northern Ireland in the 1960s and 1970s. The IRA is a major player in this, as of course the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, is the arm of rebellion and Irish independence for the mainland and also the 6 northern countries and north of Ireland for years. Gerry Adams is still living. Gerry Adams is a key player in this book, and Gerry Adams comes across as very much of a chameleon kind of a character. He was part of the IRA, but he kind of denied being part of the IRA. He sort of supported violence, but he denied supporting violence. But one of the many things this book does very, very well, to begin, it depicts the Troubles in a very realistic way. And reading about Belfast in the 60s and 70s, I had this impression that you get today when you're reading about, say, countries in the Middle East, perhaps Syria, perhaps countries that are going through upheaval, and Afghanistan, and how dangerous it is just to leave your home to go out in the street. And that is the feeling you get, I got, and many people got reading Say Nothing, because of just the tension and the danger and bombings, kidnappings, the things that were going on in Northern Ireland not that long ago, a generation or two ago, were commonplace. And it took a long time for Northern Ireland to achieve the basic stability it has now. Of course, but Ireland, you go back to 1916, you go back to Michael Collins, potato famine, Oliver Cromwell centuries ago. So there's nothing new really about the tensions in Northern Ireland, or Ireland itself, the mainland, the main country, not necessarily the north. But Say Nothing is a critically acclaimed book, and I'm so glad that I finally read it. I'm sorry that it took me so long, because other folks had talked to me about this book in the bookstore, and other people as well. The author is named Patrick Radden Keefe, and he's not from Ireland. He's Irish in descent, but he lives in Boston. And the research in the book is wonderful in terms of bringing these characters to life. It reads as well as any work of fiction, but it's nonfiction. And I'd highly recommend Say Nothing as a good book for any season, but certainly to gain knowledge of the Troubles and what's been happening fairly recently in Northern Ireland. The next book I have is a work of poetry, and it's Whale Day by Billy Collins. And Billy Collins is another poet who probably doesn't need any introduction for many of you. Every 3 or 4 years, he comes out with another book. It's quite thin. It's maybe 100 pages or so. And Billy Collins was the poet laureate of the United States 15 or 20 years ago. I think he was a New York State poet too, if I'm not mistaken. If you go on YouTube, you can see him interviewed and giving lectures, but talking about Emily Dickinson, say, or about poetry and its role in society, and that not even its role, but its importance to people and life and that type of thing. And Whale Day is just a collection of very short poems. And Billy Collins is not a difficult poet to read. He's very, and it's a little bit tough with a guy like Billy Collins, because I think there are folks that are very much enamored of poetry, and maybe a little bit more serious poetry or somewhat heavier poetry, that may begrudge someone like Collins because he has very heavy themes and very serious themes, but he presents them in a very accessible way. And I think because it's accessible doesn't mean that it's not worth reading, because he does deal a lot with death in this book. He deals with alienation. He deals with difficulties of life, of parenting, of growing old. Billy Collins is probably approaching 70, I'm not sure. And one of the themes of the book, sort of a corollary to death, is just the aging process and the things you need to kind of deal with as you get older. But he does, with the heavy themes that he talks about, he has a very light touch. He has a very subtle wit and a sense of humor that comes through in just about all of his work, all of his poetry that I've read. I've read most of it over the years. And most of his poetry books are quite short, and it's a good holiday book too. And for those of you that kind of, a lot of people might be somewhat intimidated or put off by poetry because of the pretension that it could possibly have, there's really no pretension here. It's very readable and very accessible, and worth reading too. So Whale Day by Billy Collins would be a book that I would strongly recommend as a Christmas book. And the next book I have is called The Heart, Frida Kahlo in Paris. And again, Frida Kahlo is a very well-known painter from the 20th century, who I'm sure many of you know a lot about. She's kind of becoming ubiquitous these days. You know, she's on coffee mugs, calendars with Frida Kahlo, umbrellas. We had these big pillows in the bookstore in Saratoga anyway, with a big Frida Kahlo face, which is about this size. And we had one with Einstein too. Those were the two big facial pillows we had a few months ago. I don't know if we do any longer, but Frida Kahlo was married to Diego Rivera, who was a muralist and a painter, painted murals in Mexico in the 30s and 40s. And the two of them were married, and their marriage did not, fidelity was not one of the qualities of their marriage. They were both sort of free with their life, especially Diego Rivera. And Frida Kahlo at that point was not well known. She was a struggling artist. And through her entire life, she suffered significant physical disabilities and impairments, and basically plagued her throughout her life. And what she did, really not unlike Van Gogh, is that Van Gogh more of an emotional situation, but Frida Kahlo, with the physical difficulties that she had, many of her paintings show her in sort of physical distress. If you look at her work, you could certainly see it online or see it in many, again, she's sort of all over the place these days. It's not hard to find her paintings. If you were to search with no difficulty, you could see what she has created. She's a figure, a character in many of her paintings, very realistically drawn, but also very artistically drawn. But anyway, The Heart, the book that I'm talking about, is about 1 year that Frida Kahlo spent in Europe in 1939, I believe. So it's at the cusp, but not quite into World War II in Paris. France was still France. It did not fall into Germany during the part of this book. And the book is very revealing about Frida Kahlo, because what it does is depict this 1 year of her life. It's the only time in her life she went to Paris. She was basically confined to North America most of her life. She was confined too. It was hard for her to travel because she was not physically well for basically her entire life. But she spent this year in Paris, and this was the time when she was kind of coming into her own as an artist, as a painter, who is now recognized as a worldwide talent. And it shows this little glimpse in what she did and who she associated with. Picasso was one of the people that she met over there, which certainly didn't hurt her, because Picasso was clearly already established by the 1930s. She had an affair with the author's father, so that's part of the book. Mark Petitjean is the author of the book, and his father had an affair, they think, with Frida, and that's part of the book as well. But what the novel does, not the novel, but the history, it's a biography. It's not a novel. It's true to life. It's a biography of Frida, and what it does is show this 1 year of her life, and how this little window during her time in Europe and meeting the folks that she did, and the experience of travel and going overseas, opened her up and expanded her art, so that when she returned, she was less likely to be, maybe not intimidated, but cowed perhaps by her husband, who was so famous. And she basically was able to successfully break out on her own at about the same time, not exclusively because of this, but this had a large part in that, in her own artistic progression. So if you're interested in art at all, or in Frida Kahlo, which many of you I'm sure are, I would recommend this particular book, The Heart, Frida Kahlo in Paris. I've been on this program and had a wonderful time many times. This is the first time, though, I'm recommending a book that is not released yet. This is George Saunders, and the book is called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. And this book, it will be published on January 12th of next year. So in about 2 months, this book will be out. And George Saunders, again, well known. Anybody that's familiar with American literature these days has probably at least heard of George Saunders. He is a renowned short story writer. He teaches at Syracuse University. He also wrote Lincoln in the Bardo a few years ago, which won the Man Booker Prize, which was a novel, his first novel. And this book is not a short story, and it's not a novel either. But A Swim in a Pond in the Rain is basically a book of literary criticism of all things. And you think, well, how interesting could that be? But it is just absolutely fascinating and very, very well read, and definitely worth reading. George Saunders, along with being such a popular, well-known short story writer and author, also teaches creative writing at Syracuse University. He teaches a master's program there. And each year he has 600 or 700 students who apply for his class, and he lets 6 of them in. So it's a very exclusive group. So the folks that are in his class are very serious about literature and very serious about writing, and certainly very intelligent, very creative. And what he does in this book is he basically outlines a course he's been teaching for 20 years. And this course is on 19th century Russian short stories. And again, you think, 19th century, what can that say to us today? But it says so much today that it's just, I think, incredible. The main authors that he talks about, and he actually cites with stories of theirs, are Chekhov, Tolstoy, and Gogol. And also Turgenev has a story in there as well. And what George Saunders does throughout this book is detail, why do these stories work? How do they click? What did these authors do, these famous Russian authors, to make these stories transcend their time and still be popular and still read today? And he talks about technique, he talks about style, he talks about perception, he talks about all of these things that he would be talking about to his class, his master's class in Syracuse University, where again, just a very slim fraction of people get into this class. And now we can read essentially what he's talking about in class, which is, like, to me, the coolest thing. And the stories themselves, the big bonus of this book to me is just reading these stories. And maybe many of you have read Chekhov or Tolstoy, maybe not so much Gogol, he's not as well known. But Chekhov's Great Humanity, and he's probably the preeminent short story writer, maybe of all time. People might argue whether or not he is, but he certainly is considered as one of those great short story writers. Tolstoy, known more for his novels, perhaps, but also for his short stories. And Gogol is just, when I first read him years ago when I went to college, and back a long time ago, I was just blown away by how great Gogol is. And Gogol is just, he had a very funny writer. It's just, and you don't really associate Russian literature with humor, but he was very, very funny. And the story that it's in this book that George Saunders includes is called The Nose. And it's about this nose that kind of, what happens at the beginning of the book, there's a barber, and he's having breakfast with his wife, and these two people don't like each other. They're at each other's throats all the time, you can tell. And the wife throws this loaf of bread on the table, and she says, "Here, have your bread." So the barber cuts into the bread, and he sees a nose in the bread, and he says, "What's this doing here? Why is there a nose in the bread?" And then the wife is yelling at him for he shaved someone the other day, and he thought that was this person's nose, and it goes on like that for a few pages. Then a few pages after that, there's a person who's looking in the mirror, and he finds out, "Hey, my nose is gone. What happened?" And you have this kind of surreal, deadpan description of these events that have no correlation whatsoever to what's happening and what would happen in the real world, but it's done with just absolute wit and humor that's just so surreal it becomes sort of hyper-realism. He's been described as that kind of a writer. So just to be exposed to people like Tolstoy and Chekhov and Gogol makes A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, to me, very much worth reading. And my final book is an older book called Mrs. Bridge. This was written in 1959, and the author is Evan S. Connell. This was his first book. And Mrs. Bridge is an upper class Kansas City matron in the 1930s and 1940s. And the book is about her life. And it takes her life through 113 very, very short chapters. And the chapters move along at this very, very quick pace. They're like little vignettes, 1 or 2 pages of each story. And the chapters are like, Mrs. Bridge goes shopping with her friends. Mrs. Bridge takes Spanish lessons. Mrs. Bridge gets into an argument with her kid. Her husband is Walter Bridge, who was an attorney in Kansas City at this time, very well-to-do family. Mrs. Bridge doesn't have to work, so she is sort of she is as conventional can be in her ideas and her beliefs, and she just really doesn't, she tries her best, but she has trouble kind of being herself. And her book is about her and how she gets by in her life. but it's told without condensation. It's not a patronizing book. There's no judgment about her. And she becomes sort of a universal character. And there's still Mrs. Bridges today. Patients, there are people, men and women both, who are, when you're secluded, you really don't have the opportunities, you don't have the associations that you would like to have, and you're sort of confined into this little cocoon. And then what happens to that person after days or weeks or months of that? And the story is told just absolutely beautifully. I think it's a great, to me, it's a great novel. It really is. And it's wonderful to be able to talk about something like this, because I don't imagine a lot of people know about Evan S. Connell. He died a few years ago, and he wrote all over the board with his books later on in his life. But I would definitely recommend Mrs. Bridge as a book for any time or any season. And that's all I've got.
Thank you so much, Mike. That's a great list. Thank you for telling us about them. So next up, the wonderful John Fine, who basically runs the receiving department in our Vermont store. I was asking before he started, because he is one of the very first people that I met before the Saratoga store had even opened. And I asked, how long have you been with the Northshire? He joined the store first in 1998. So he knows all the things about all the things that go on at Northshire and really keeps everything running in the Vermont store. So it's a real thrill and a pleasure to have the wonderful John Fine here tonight to tell us about what he's been reading lately.
Thank you, Rachel. I brought a variety of books that are not just things I've recently been reading. They're not just recent releases, but sort of a full year's recap of highlights, I think, that will make great gift ideas. Since we are approaching that time, we're sort of in that time, especially if we're going to be shopping early this year. First up, I have Dutch Girl, which is, it's the subtitle is Audrey Hepburn in World War II. When I first picked it up, one of the advantages, honestly, of where I work in the basement is sometimes if there's a damaged book, I will scoop it up and bring it home and read it if I'm interested, because it's not going to go on the sales floor. When I first picked up this book, honestly, I did have a question as to whether this was something that was going to be, even though it's called Audrey Hepburn in World War II, I didn't know if it was substantive enough. Even though I recently become an Audrey Hepburn fan, I didn't really know what to expect. If I should feel a little, I don't know, not embarrassed, but just like I was indulging in something that maybe was not a true work of scholarship. But in all honesty, this is a real gem. And it's, every now and then I think the major publishers probably missed out on a gem, because I'm surprised that this is, I've never heard of Goodnight Books, but this is something that maybe they should regret not having published at this point. It sells really well for us, and I have a recommend tag that when something sells, I write a recommend tag for. It makes you feel good, but I'm not sure that Audrey Hepburn needs my help. But anyway, it's been selling pretty well. And what's so good about it is the rich tapestry of the history, not just of Audrey Hepburn as a young girl, but of Holland and its role in World War II. So much of which I had not really been aware of. What you end up coming away with is not just a knowledge of Audrey Hepburn's childhood, but a deep appreciation for what the Dutch people went through in World War II. The suffering, the long-term suffering, they were heavily bombed. What you end up learning, and I'm not to give away too much, but there's so much that leads to who Audrey Hepburn would become. If you've ever picked up on that unique, delightful way of speaking she was not actually born in Holland, despite being called Dutch Girl. She was born in Belgium, but her parents sent her to London for schooling. So she has that very distinctive accent that she enunciates more clearly than most Americans or English-born people. Her role, again, I don't like to give away too much, but her family was kind of holed up eventually in place due to the bombing. The village is called Arnhem, where they were. The bridge is portrayed in a pretty well-known book and movie called The Bridge Too Far. The major battles happen there, and there's a lot to learn about Audrey's childhood, her growing up as a dance student, her talent as a dance student, her mother's political background and how that shaped Audrey's future, as well as the physical hardships she went through that actually shaped her long-term physical appearance and unfortunately shortened her life, most likely. That's all in there, and I highly recommend it. Dutch Girl by Robert Matson. This is not a new book per se. I think it came out last year, but I came across it this year. And if you have anyone in your life who is a fan or a student of rock and roll history, this particular book, Stone Free, is not just, it has a full background on Jimi Hendrix's beginnings, but what it really focuses in on is when Jimi Hendrix went to London as a young and upcoming musician, discovered by Chaz Chandler of the Animals, and kind of the explosive eruptions in his musical world that happened thereafter. Before that, the British invasion had been going on, the musical British invasion, which is a remarkable thing in and of itself, but Jimmy's invasion of Britain is no less remarkable. And I have a sort of a lifelong interest in reading about musical icons. And this was, to me, a very special read because Jimi Hendrix did more to shape and transform modern music than many other people in that, just in that 1 year when he went to London. This is 1966, 67. They started recording an album. He had not written an original song. Within those few months, he ended up writing material for Are You Experienced, which went on to change rock and roll and change the world. And it's still, no matter how many times I come across it, it still kind of blows my mind. What he accomplished at such a young age and in such a short amount of time. This book, I just going into the mix. I apologize to Dafydd because I didn't pre-warn because I came across it upstairs. This is a newer book on Jimi Hendrix. It's by Philip Norman, who's a really well-known, respected music writer. Probably more of a broader Jimi Hendrix portrait. It's been getting great reviews. So if there's someone in your life who would appreciate a full profile of the life of Jimi Hendrix, this seems to be the way to go as well. Wild Thing by Philip Norman. Okay, I reach into my bag of tricks again, excuse me. The next book is called The Road to San Donato. This was actually given to me by a coworker from Saratoga named Becky. She picked it up for me in the book show, I think the New England Booksellers show, because she knows that I am a fan of the Tour de France and bike racing. And this was what I'd call a sleeper. I did not expect it to be such a rich and rewarding read as it ended up being. Ostensibly, I was beginning to read it because it was about a father and son cycling across Italy. And it had a certain amount of appeal to me, but it grows into so much more as you keep reading. It ends up being a tale of Italian immigrant family, 3 generations. The writer is a Bostonian. His father is this colorful character who owns a hair salon, rides like reckless, like a madman to work every day on his bike. They end up agreeing to cycle across Italy together. And it's a mountainous ride through the hills of Tuscany, just gorgeous, gorgeous setting, but very grueling. And as they process these challenges together, they grow closer together. And that was enjoyable enough for me, to be honest, because just as you could, the romantic picture of being out there, and that's usually the reason why I enjoy watching the Tour de France, is the amazing scenery. But when they get to San Donato, the history of this little town, which is located in the hills between Florence and Siena, just a remarkable cast of rich characters there, and the history of that town and its role in helping to hide and save Jewish visitors from Nazi troops. I guess the original, the Nazis dropped them off, Jews, that is, that they'd rounded up, and somehow the townspeople were able to sort of ingeniously and with much bravery and ingenuity save the lives of so many the Jewish people. And again, it's a heartwarming story by the time you're done, that takes you from Boston to San Donato to the history of World War II, and it all weaves together, a very heartwarming tale. Sharks in a Time of Saviors, one of my favorite books of the year, set on the Hawaiian Islands. And I actually, it's a complex enough plot that I'm going to fall back on my own review to sort of sum it up initially. More than an ode to the culture, geography, botany, and lore of the Hawaiian people and islands, although it does very much achieve that so eloquently and beautifully, Washburn's novel is a microcosmic look at what it is to be an economically deprived family in the steamrolled minority culture. All three of the florist's children struggle to find their place in the world, in and beyond the islands. Older brother Dean and younger sister Kauai are more specifically tasked with finding their own way to distinguish themselves from middle child Nainoa, the chosen one, the healer, the gifted one, the cursed. There's both magic and suffering here, just as there are on the islands of Hawaii. So just a little bit of background on the title. And I'm sure I'm saying the name wrong. It's Nainoa, Nainoa. As a child, falls off of a boat in the ocean off the coast, and is brought back to the boat, saved by a shark. And his whole life, there's a lot of supernatural elements to this story. So that is the beginning of his relationship, his supernatural relationship with animals and with the world, and the challenges that arise because of that, and the challenges that brings his siblings. But again, Sharks in the Time of Saviors, Kauai, Strong Washburn, highly recommended. I don't typically, my son is grown, I don't typically read a lot of children's books, but I do see a lot of them come through. This one caught my eye, as you can maybe tell by the cover. We have had, in the past year, been a lot of books on the topic of Black children's hair, and that's a great thing, because as obviously I'm not a Black child, obviously I don't know much about hair, but there is a struggle in the culture frequently for Black children to feel integrated, because their hair is different, and they struggle for self-esteem in that regard. This one caught my eye. The hair is, and the artwork is astounding. The back cover, my hair has power, my hair has spirit, every way I wear it. And it's just really so well done. And some beautiful artwork. And the way it's handled throughout. Let's see if I can find one page just to tell you how well it's my hair has flow, my hair has soul, rhythmic as waterfalls, warm as an embrace that consoles. My hair has power, my hair has spirit, every way I wear it. So if you're looking for a gift for any young person, I think it's not just about books like this don't just help Black children to feel more a part of the culture, more appreciated. They help everyone to understand more about multiculturalism and to appreciate differences and embrace them. And lastly, one of the few benefits of the pandemic, my view thus far, has been that we've been able to hire a lot of new young people at the store who wouldn't necessarily have been around, and it's really been a joy to work with them. One of them I've been working with in my department. Courtney read this book first, called The Orchard, and I've just started reading it, so I already am enjoying greatly at page 85, but let me read a little bit of Courtney's review, and then I'll tell you my own view. Ari Eden, a bored Hasidic teenager, moves to a ritzy Miami suburb where he discovers the many ways different people and families navigate their faith, and as is the case for many of his classmates, their extreme wealth. The Orchard is the kind of book that you can't put down while reading and then can't stop thinking about when you finish. My view, I'm beginning my review that I will end up writing for the website and for the store. And I'm not done with it yet, but my words so far are this about place and displacement, religious devotion and its near total abandonment, class and underclass. And most definitely it's a tale of two cities as regards the Jewish faith, old school Brooklyn and Nouveau Riche, South Florida. I discovered to my surprise that I hadn't remembered it's actually coming out next week. We get so lost. We live in the book world week to week and release dates. And when I read that it was coming out in November, it then occurred to me that this is November, so it's already here. It's next week already. So this is highly recommended by both myself and Courtney, and I look forward to finishing reading it. Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you, John. That's a great list. So Dafydd and I, as I mentioned at the beginning, also both have short lists. Before I go into mine, just a reminder for those of you who joined us late, if you missed any titles, we'll be posting a blog post tomorrow at northshire.com in the Notes from the Shire blog with all of these titles. So you can see that, see them there. And also, if you ever have any questions about them, you can always email myself and Dafydd at events@northshire.com, and we're happy to remind you of titles that you forgot about. We share that email address, so one or the other of us will always get to it, even in busy times. So I have a few titles. I'm going to start off with a young adult novel that I read a little while back and feels very fresh right now. It's called Yes, No, Maybe So. This is co-written by two young adult authors, both with really lovely books of their own, to their credit, Becky Albertalli and Aisha Saeed. And this story began when the two of them, they both live in the Atlanta suburbs, and in January or so of 2017, there was a special election in their district with a young man named John Ossoff running for the House of Representatives. And the two of them got together and started knocking on doors for him. And as they were doing that, they came up with the idea, well, what if there were two teenagers who were like us, one Jew and one Muslim, who were suddenly thrown together working on this campaign together? What would happen? And so the two of them wrote this book together in alternating chapters told from the perspective of these two teenagers who both, in this case, in the case of the book, get sort of roped into volunteering on this campaign by their parents. And it's a very sweet, fluffy, young adult love story, but it's also this real look at what it is to work on a campaign, and a campaign that may not be a winning one, a campaign where you may lose and you may have to pick yourself up at the end and figure out what happens next. So the campaign that they're working on in this is not actually John Ossoff, but it's sort of based on that race that these two authors experienced. And it's a really lovely book. So this one is Yes, No, Maybe So by Becky Albertalli and Aisha Saeed. It's written for teenagers. It's great for any teenagers you have in your life. It's also a really delightful read for adults, especially adults who might want something that's a little bit of a fast page turner for themselves. Next up is something that is just fun, pure fun, which we all need from time to time. This is called I Was Told It Would Get Easier by Abby Waxman. And it is a mother and daughter who are on a very high-end college road trip, a guided tour to tour around different colleges. The daughter's a junior or senior in high school. The mother's very, very, very intensely type A. And they are off to have this journey together. And the mother is hoping that it will repair her relationship with her daughter. It will get her daughter motivated to go to the kind of school that she, the mother, thinks the daughter should go to. The daughter doesn't want anything to do with this. Hijinks and hilarity ensue. I tore through this in 2 days and enjoyed every second of it. So that's, I Was Told It Would Get Easier by Abby Waxman. So if you know people who need a happy distraction, or you yourself need a happy distraction, this is a great book for them. Then I have a fantasy novel, also actually written for teenagers, but again, crosses over, great for adults or kids. This is called The Left-Handed Booksellers of London by Garth Nix. Garth Nix is a great sort of long-time fantasy author for young people. And in this one, the tagline on the front cover is authorized to kill and sell books. So it's this clan of magical booksellers whose role in the world is to protect the world from bad magic. The left-handed ones do violence and the right-handed ones do research. And they work together to try to keep the world safe. And it all starts off when a young woman who strange things start happening to her, and she moves to London and she gets caught up with one of the left-handed booksellers in a very dangerous plot that she has to deal with. I stayed up much, much too late finishing this, well past my bedtime. It's actually one of the few books that I was able to actually pay attention to in the last few weeks. So that's saying something. It's really a delight. So The Left-Handed Booksellers of London. There are also tons of literary references scattered throughout it. So it keeps referring back, because of course the booksellers, they all know their books. And so it keeps referring back to other books. The last book on my list, I don't actually have a copy with me. I lent it out and it has not made its way back to me yet. But it is a literary biography. It is called The Life and Loves of E. Nesbit, Victorian iconoclast, children's author, and creator of the Railway. So Edith Nesbit was my absolute favorite author when I was a kid. And I actually often sort of rope kids into reading her books. And I start them off with 5 Children and It, which is hilarious children's fantasy. She wrote in the Victorian era and really is in many ways, I think, sort of an intellectual predecessor to a lot of children's fantasy that's out there. She wrote with a real sense of humor and had this sort of magical system where it was the real world and it was like our real world, but with magic in it. Her books are just delightful. But I had never known much about her until I happened to pick up this biography, which just came out this fall. She was a member of the Fabian Society. She believed in free love. She did all sorts of wild and crazy things and had this totally out there life for a Victorian woman, and was able at the same time to have an extremely successful career writing children's books, which I think really sort of upended a lot of how we think about the Victorian era for me. So it's thick, it's dense, it's a lot, it goes into a lot of tangents about like her sister's fiance and what his family was doing. So it's one of those books that you want to like either have some time to really dig into it or read it in bits and pieces as it goes. But I found it absolutely fascinating to look at this woman's life. So whether you read E. Nesbit as a child yourself or have kids in your life who read E. Nesbit or not, this is definitely a really enjoyable book. But if you ever have been an E. Nesbit fan, It's really, really, really one to pick up. And then one just last book that I want to quickly mention is actually a book we're having an event for later on this week. I have not finished it yet, so I can't give the full review, but it is Loved and Wanted, a memoir of choice, children, and womanhood by Krista Paravani. She's doing an event with us actually tomorrow evening. The writing in this is gorgeous. As I said, I'm only a part way into it, but this is her memoir of being denied an abortion and what happened next, and her love for her child and what that experience was. But it's a very rich literary piece of writing that's going through different times in her life in this very beautiful way. So as I said, I'm only a little bit into it, but I'm really, really struck by it and enjoying it. With us tomorrow evening if you're free. So Loved and Wanted by Krista Paravani. So that is all I have on my list to talk about. I see someone in the comments saying that Abby Waxman also wrote The Bookish Life of Nina Hill, which is in fact, as Beth said in the comments, really delightful and funny. That's another great book. So yes, strongly recommend Abby Waxman, whatever she does. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Dafydd, who has a couple of great books to tell us about.
Thanks, Rachel. This has been really fun to hear, everybody. And there's also a question, and that I think you guys can answer, that I got in the chat. I'd like to ask for at the end, does the store make any money from Kobo.com ebooks sales? She doesn't like to read paper anymore, but I want to support the store. What advice can you give for readers like me? She's got her Kobo account connected to Northshire, and I don't know anything about Kobo.
We do. It's not a ton, but it is not nothing either. So whenever I wind up buying ebooks, I always buy them through there myself, because it's a little fraction of what you're spending on Kobo comes to us, but it is something. And for anyone who does audiobooks, actually Libro FM, we have a similar relationship with, and you can subscribe to Libro FM for your audiobooks, and we get a cut of that. I think a slightly more generous cut actually from Libro than we do from Kobo. But there is, in terms of ebooks, if you want to buy ebooks and support Northshire, Kobo is the best option for that. So thank you for that question. Yes, it helps us.
All right, so I've got two books, and they're both weird because I read weird stuff. And I've only got a picture of one, and this is Megan Rosenblum's Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. It is a little gruesome. There's only one picture in it, and I will show it to you now, and it's a very appropriate picture. It's a nice little leather-bound book with a very delicately made skull there. But it's a really fascinating book, and she talks about, there's a test, the scientific test that's been used that you can, she's a librarian, she cuts off a little tiniest fragment of it and they test it and they can identify if it's something's human or not. The vast majority of these, in fact, I believe all of the books that are bound in human flesh are from 19th century doctors who basically didn't use patient consent very honestly. That's a complete, and she talks a little bit about the history of medicine and where things like that come from. It's a really fascinating book. She says, of course, none of them look like the visions from horror movies. And so there's a lot of dispelling of rumors. The first chapter is about a famous example of a rumor, a bit of a fake news of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the French Declaration of Independence, basically, from the French Revolution, being bound in the human skin of a victim of the guillotine, which she says is absolutely untrue, and that she tested it and it is not human skin. Lots of these things are not human. All of them really are doctors that somehow had access to a body in a disreputable way and then bound one of these books for whatever reason into this and make these objects. And a lot of the question is, what do we do with these things? Some people want to bury them. Some people say we should incinerate them. She says, no, it's what she studies. She's from the Mutter Museum. She's the head librarian and medical librarian there. And she, in this book, sort of talks about the victims when she can, and the doctors who made them. The last book I want to recommend, I don't have a copy of it with me at the moment, but it's a gorgeous book called African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, edited by Kevin Young, and it's in the Library of America series. It just came out, and it is just an amazing anthology of poetry. It's about 1,000 pages, and it is the anthology for some generations, for the next several generations, I'd say. The book, it starts with Phyllis Wheatley and goes directly to the present with Asia Monet's Say Her Name, which is a powerful poem there in the end of it. But it is it's a real testament. There's Langston Hughes, of course, and Rita Dove and Maya Angelou and all the people you would expect. But the real prize of the book is all the discoveries you'll make. There's a poem that was reading this a couple of weeks ago, and I just want to share a few lines from it. This is by one of the Harlem Renaissance poets, Claude McKay, who's not as well known, but he says in one of his poems called "The White Man is a Tiger at My Throat," Europe and Asia, Africa await a new fascism, the American brand, and new worlds will be built upon race and hate, and the eagle and the dollar will command. It just blew me away. I had no idea that some of that stuff was in there. I had no idea this late poem of his. There's all kinds of great discoveries for months. Major Jackson is him here, whom you might know, but there's Terrence Hayes. There's a guest we've had on this program, Rachel Eliza Griffiths. There's the Pulitzer winner, Natasha Trethewey, whom Mike recommended her recent memoir, Monument, recently on one of these programs. But really, as I said, it's the discoveries that are amazing. There's a group from 1845. There's poets that were called Les Senelles, who were a group of free Creoles of color that published the first book of African-American poetry, the first anthology of it. But really the book starts, as it should, with Phyllis Wheatley, who is the very first African-American poet. So you might know of her. She published her first book in 1770, and she had quite the life. She was taken from Senegal at the age of 7 and enslaved. She was named Phyllis after the slave ship that took her across the Middle Passage. She learned writing. She studied the poems of Alexander Pope. And as she was writing these, she had to stand trial to a group of white men to prove that this African enslaved woman wrote these poems. In another great book, the Amiri Ibram X. Kendi's, I wasn't prepared for this one, not How to Be an Anti-Racist, but the previous book on the history of anti-racism. Yeah, what?
Stamped from the beginning.
Stamped from the beginning. Thank you, John. Oh yeah, he talks at length about Phyllis Wheatley and this trial. Anyway, so there was no one in the country who would publish her book, so she had to travel across the Atlantic once again to England to a publisher who would publish it, where, ironically, of course, she was free, and then had to travel back to the United States. Ultimately, she was able to buy her freedom. She died young, sadly, in poverty, but the example of her also was one of the major influences on the nascent anti-slavery movement. So anyway, that's my book. It's an amazing book. It's a real testament. There's great stuff from modernists that you haven't heard of, to some of my favorites. Jane Toomer's in there, as I said, Claude McKay. We did Richard Wright, Dudley Randall, County Cullen. It's a real treasure. Derek Walcott, everybody's in there. So anyway, I highly recommend that one. And thanks. That's the last of my books.
So we have about 5 minutes left. No obligation to stick around if you need to be other places, but if in these last 5 minutes, if people have recommendations of their own that they'd like to share in the chat, we can read them out, or Stump the Bookseller questions, like I need a great history for my uncle who loves World War II history, or whatever. Ask us questions. share your own recommendations. We're happy to use these few minutes that we've got left to give more recommendations to order or to share whatever you've all been reading lately. If people also just want to unmute and ask a question, you may do that. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of the evening, we are recording this, and if you unmute and talk into your microphone, you will be part of the recording. So most people.
There's a question from Claire that she sent me asking if Lucy Prince is in the anthology, and I'm looking that up if I'm looking distracted.
I loved Linda's comment. She said that she watched a documentary called The Booksellers last week, and it talked specifically about books covered with human skin. I had no idea that that was a real thing. Rebecca says that Big Summer by Jennifer Weiner is great, which, yes, such a good book, wonderful. And then Carol mentions actually one of Mike's great staff picks that he's talked about a lot, which is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, and saying that he's loving it. And I know that that's one that Mike loved. Linda, it sounds like you wanted to say something?
Well, just about the booksellers, I found it at the library. So, and then since I mentioned it to other Booktopians, somebody said it was streaming on like Amazon Prime or something like that. But it's 90 minutes, very interesting.
Cool, thank you. Claire says that she always gets a beautiful coffee table book every year as a forever book for myself. Any recommendations for anything like that?
There's a book I was just looking at, Claire, and that we're going to see again when if you join us on Thursday the 19th for our publishers rep night, when we have the publisher reps who we love coming. One of the highlights of working at Northshire is them come and they come talk about the new books. Of course, they haven't gotten to do that, but Michael Kindness from Random House is going to be talking about this book, and I'm gonna remember the title in just a moment or find it real soon. Just a second.
Well, Dafydd is looking for that. There's a recommendation in the chat for Claire, which is a great recommendation of the book Humans by Brandon Stanton. He is best known as the photographer who does the Humans of New York blog, though he has scaled out and now travels the world. His work is remarkable and beautiful, and if you're on any form of social media, it's worth following him wherever you are, because he takes pictures of people and then interviews them. And somehow he really captures who they are and why he's taking their picture. So that is a great suggestion. I'm just putting a link to that in the chat.
Putting a link now in the
Give a plug. I'm going to give a plug for a book for an author that really doesn't need much of a plug. And this is Jodi Picoult's last book, A Book of Two Ways. I've been waiting for her to write this book for a very long time. I met her when she was first out on the trail, plugging her first books herself and becoming a very popular author through time. I found at that time when I met her, she's an extremely bright woman who has a very good background in history and science, and often her books do not show that. This last book was, I thought, fantastic. I just loved it. At its heart, it's a love story, but there's a lot about Egypt and archaeology and a death doula that is extremely interesting as a career. I hope that she continues to show some of the brilliance of her life in her future books. Read it. Good.
So Linda sent me a note suggesting also as a coffee table book, Shade, A Tale of Two Presidents by Pete Souza, especially if you're happy about the recent election results, which he was the official White House photographer under Obama. And he, shortly after Trump took office, started just posting photographs from the Obama White House that he felt were apropos to the moment of whatever was going on in that time. And this new book is sort of a compilation of his photographs and his comments. I put a link into what I think is the new Bruce Springsteen coffee table book in the chat. And Cynthia says it is, in fact, it's Bruce Springsteen, All the Songs, the Story Behind Every Track. And it came out in October. And looking at the cover, it actually does look absolutely gorgeous. And then Dafydd, did you find the book that Michael Kindness had recommended?
I did. Michael's going to be recommending this, and I think I'm going to be recommending it too when I see a copy of it. Peter Mendelsohn, he is a book jacket designer. His new book, The Look of the Book, Jackets, Covers, and Art at the Edges of Literature. It's a beautiful book about book jackets. And it looks really cool, and from what I've seen, the pictures wise. And then we've got another suggestion from Carol in the chat for Frances May's book, which I have a copy of. Let me grab that real quick. The last Frances May's book, Always Italy, which it was also this. I got this because it was, like John was talking about, another perk of the job, a damaged copy. And this is a beautiful book full of wonderful photographs from the National Geographic, wonderful places that you can imagine visiting when the world is better. Anyway, it's a gorgeous book. It's a beautiful coffee table book, and not too bad.
So I think that is just about all we have time for. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Thank you, John and Mike, for your great suggestions. I know my reading list has grown, as it always does. Thank you, audience, for your suggestions and your questions and your presence this evening. As Dafydd mentioned, we will be doing another book picks night coming up later on in the month, where some of our great sales reps from the publishers are going to come and tell about their recent reads, which is always a really fun event at the store when they come and tell us booksellers. So we're excited to get to share that with all of you. Also, we have a couple more bookseller office hour dates coming up in November. So if you are looking for personalized recommendation for your holiday shopping, you can sign on to one of those, and we will go through your list with you and try to come up with ideas of gifts you can give to everyone and anyone on your list. So hopefully that will help out. And if there are other things that we can be doing as Northshire to help make holiday shopping easier in this time of social distancing, feel free to reach out to me and Dafydd, again, at events@northshire.com, and we're happy to take your suggestions. Thank you so much, everybody.
Have a good evening.
And have a great night.